The Arcanian protocol demanded utmost precision. 3 massive ships of the consortium's first contact fleet hung motionless in the void beyond Mars, their crystalline hulls refracting sunlight into prismatic displays that would have stunned any watching eyes. Commander Zextal, her iridescent scales rippling with anticipation, reviewed the preliminary data for the 13th time. Another primitive species, she chittered to her subordinates, barely reached their moon. Perfect candidates for integration into the labor force. The euphemism drew knowing clicks from her bridge crew. After all, the consortium had integrated 17 species in the past century alone. The humans' radio transmissions painted a picture the consortium found irresistible, a fractured species, constantly at war with itself, yet remarkably adaptable and resilient. Their planet's high gravity and atmospheric composition classified it as a death world, meaning the specimens would be particularly valuable in the consortium's mines and labor camps. But the first sign that something was terribly wrong came when their long-range sensors detected the orbital defense grid. It shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there. A species at this development stage shouldn't have been able to construct something so sophisticated. Commander, her sensor officer called out, mandibles twitching nervously. I'm detecting artificial structures on Mars. And they're active. Before Zextal could process this information, space itself seemed to tear open around her fleet. Ships emerged from what her instruments identified as artificial wormholes. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They were unlike anything in the consortium database. Angular, brutally efficient designs bristling with weapon systems that made her combat analysts screech in alarm. Unidentified vessels, a transmission cut through their communications in perfect consortium standard. You have entered restricted space. Your vessels match known configurations of the consortium's slave fleet. You have 30 seconds to power down and prepare for boarding, or we will assume hostile intent. Zextal's copper blood ran cold. They knew. Somehow, they knew about the consortium. And worse, they had been waiting. Impossible, she breathed. They're supposed to be primitive. Their technology level. Commander, her weapons officer screamed. Their targeting systems, they've already locked onto our quantum cores. They can see through our shields. The human ships took up attack positions with practiced precision. Their formation was unlike anything in consortium tactical databases, a 3-dimensional web that nullified the consortium fleet's traditional advantages. Power down, Zextal ordered, her pride crumbling before cold reality. Power down everything. As human boarding craft approached her vessel, Zextal realized the consortium had made a catastrophic error. They had assumed humanity's limited interplanetary presence meant technological inferiority. They had never considered that humans might have chosen to focus on defensive capabilities first, building in secret, preparing for precisely this kind of encounter. The boarding parties moved with terrifying efficiency. Their combat frames, mechanized suits that made even the strongest consortium warrior look frail, carved through security checkpoints with contemptuous ease. Their neural scramblers rendered resistance futile, dropping consortium crews without firing a single lethal shot. In her command center, Zextal watched the boarding team's leader approach. The human removed their helmet, revealing a face that would haunt consortium nightmares for years to come, not for any inherent terror in their features, but for the expression they wore. Not anger, not hatred, just disappointed determination, like a parent who had caught a child doing something unforgivable. Commander Zextal, the human said, again in perfect consortium standard. I'm Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth Defense Force. We've spent the last decade investigating your organization's activities in this sector. We've liberated 3 of your processing centers already. The slaves you took from them told us everything. Zextal's scales dulled in shock. That's not possible. Our security was designed to stop slave races from communicating. Chen finished. We're not a slave race. Never were. Never will be. And after today, neither will anyone else in this sector. As she was led away in custody, Zextal saw the truth that would soon shake the consortium to its foundations. Humans hadn't just prepared for first contact, they had prepared for war. Not a war of conquest or extermination, but a war of liberation. The consortium had thought they were approaching another primitive species to exploit. Instead, they had awakened humanity's most primal drive, the urge to protect the defenseless and punish those who would harm them. The message sent back to consortium space was brief. First contact protocol failed. Humans were ready. They know everything. Advise immediate diplomatic contact before they come to us. But it was already too late. Human ships were already moving through the sector, following trails left in the consortium's own databases. The silent war for galactic freedom had begun, and humanity had fired the first shot without their enemies even realizing they were on the battlefield. In the decades that followed, the consortium would learn what countless human adversaries had learned before. Humans were at their most dangerous not when fighting for themselves, but when fighting for others. And they had just found an entire galaxy of others to fight for. Admiral James Chen stared at the holographic display of known consortium space, each slave processing center marked in sickly red. 6 months had passed since humanity's first official contact with the slavers, and the true scope of their operation had become horrifyingly clear. 18 billion sentients, he said quietly to the assembled War Council, spread across 300 worlds. And those are just the ones we know about. The conference room aboard the EDF Nightingale hummed with suppressed anger. Representatives from various Earth nations and military branches sat alongside the growing number of alien defectors who had joined humanity's cause. Crix, a former consortium data analyst whose crystalline form caught the room's light, manipulated the display with neural commands. The consortium's power structure is built on 3 pillars, they explained. The Mercath handle acquisition and processing. The Velkar manage transportation and security. The Ixtheri control distribution and profit management. And they've been doing this for how long? Asked Colonel Sarah Chen, the Admiral's sister and head of special operations. Nearly 10,000 standard cycles, Crix replied. They've perfected their methods. Any direct military action against their core worlds would result in the immediate execution of billions of slaves. Admiral Chen nodded grimly, which is why we're not going to attack them directly. Operation Ghostlight begins today. The hologram shifted, showing hundreds of human stealth ships already in position throughout consortium space. They were practically invisible, using technology reverse engineered from studying the quantum cores of the captured first contact fleet. Our ships have been seeding quantum encrypted communication nodes throughout their territory, Chen continued. We're building a shadow network that will allow slaves to communicate and coordinate without the consortium's knowledge. But that's just phase 1. Colonel Chen took over, her expression fierce. Phase 2 involves our new allies. She gestured to the alien defectors. They're helping us identify sympathetic elements within consortium society, people who oppose the slavery but have been too afraid to act. We're going to give them the means and the courage to resist. The hologram zoomed in on a massive space station, the consortium's largest slave processing center in the Orion Arm. This is Station X-47, she explained. In 3 days, it will experience a catastrophic life support failure. In the chaos, all of its security systems will mysteriously malfunction, and 40,000 slaves will somehow find themselves aboard automated transport ships bound for free space. The consortium will know it's us, one of the Earth representatives pointed out. They'll suspect, Admiral Chen corrected, but they won't be able to prove it. And more importantly, they won't be able to stop it, because while they're investigating X-47, similar accidents will be occurring throughout their territory. Their own people will be helping us, and they won't know who to trust. Crix's crystalline form pulsed with what humans had learned was their equivalent of grim satisfaction. The consortium maintains power through fear and absolute control of information. Once their slaves can communicate freely, once their own people start questioning their actions, their entire system begins to crack, Colonel Chen finished. We're not just freeing slaves, we're breaking their foundation. The next 3 months saw a wave of inexplicable malfunctions, mysterious disappearances, and unprecedented slave revolts throughout consortium space. Security forces would arrive at processing centers to find them empty, with no sign of how the slaves had escaped. Supply ships would vanish only to reappear weeks later, their slave cargo gone, and their crews unable to remember what had happened. The consortium leadership grew increasingly paranoid. They could see humanity's hand in these events, but every investigation led nowhere. Their own security forces began to turn on each other, each of the 3 ruling species suspecting the others of sabotage or betrayal. Meanwhile, in secret bases throughout free space, liberated slaves were being given something they had never had before: choice. Those who wanted to fight were trained and equipped by human special forces. Those who wanted to help others escape were taught the art of covert operations. And those who simply wanted to live in peace were given sanctuary on worlds that had pledged to protect them. Admiral Chen stood on the observation deck of the Nightingale, watching as another group of rescue ships arrived with their precious cargo of freed souls. Beside him, Crix monitored the growing shadow network. The Mercath have just increased security at their primary shipyards, they reported. They're claiming the Velkar cannot be trusted to protect their assets. Chen allowed himself a small smile. And how many of those new security forces are actually our allies? Approximately 40%, Crix replied, their crystalline form flickering with what Chen now recognized as amusement. The consortium is literally inviting liberation forces into their most sensitive facilities. The admiral nodded, watching as the rescue ships docked. Every freed slave was another crack in the consortium's foundation. Every successful operation increased the confidence of their growing network of allies within the consortium itself. They thought they were the masters of slavery, Chen mused. But they never understood that chains work both ways. The harder they try to maintain control, the more it slips through their fingers. The silent war was reshaping the galaxy, one freed soul at a time. And the consortium, for all their power and technology, couldn't stop what they couldn't see coming. The Velkar Ascendancy's flagship, Eternal Dominion, hung in space like a twisted cathedral, its spires and arches housing the most secure slave processing facility in the sector. Captain Maya Rodriguez, aboard the stealth corvette Shadowstep, watched through quantum-shifted sensors as slave transports docked with practiced precision. Target confirmed, her XO whispered, though there was no need for stealth in the vacuum of space. The consortium's entire ruling council is aboard for their centennial inspection. Security is exactly as our intelligence suggested. Maya nodded, her augmented eyes scanning data streams from their infiltration teams. For 6 months, they had planted operatives throughout the facility. Former slaves altered to appear as consortium species, human deep cover agents, and even genuine consortium defectors. Today, everything would change. All teams, execute Operation Avalanche, she subvocalized through the quantum-encrypted network. Weapons free, non-lethal priority. Remember, we're here to free them, not become them. Across the massive facility, precisely coordinated chaos erupted. Environmental systems began reporting cascading failures. Security barriers activated randomly, trapping guard forces in isolated sections. And in the slave-holding areas, the control collars simultaneously deactivated, their quantum locks cracked by months of careful coding. The consortium council members found themselves trapped in their luxurious observation deck as emergency shutters slammed down. Through the windows, they watched in horror as their perfectly orchestrated system dissolved into mayhem. In the main processing chamber, Senior Agent Kira Chen, the colonel's daughter, led her team through the confusion. Their combat frames, disguised as maintenance units, suddenly transformed into their true configurations. Consortium guards found their weapons refusing to fire, their systems hacked at the quantum level. This is a liberation action. Kira's voice boomed through the facility's comm system in multiple languages. All slaves are hereby freed. All security personnel, power down your weapons. You will not be harmed if you cooperate. The response was beyond their wildest expectations. Nearly a third of the security forces immediately stood down. Sleeper agents and sympathizers they hadn't even known about. Another third, seeing the overwhelming force arrayed against them, chose survival over loyalty to the consortium. Maya watched from the shadow step as hundreds of stealth ships decloaked around the facility. The Eternal Dominion's weapons remained silent, their targeting systems compromised months ago by their own maintenance crews. Inside the facility, Kira led columns of freed slaves toward waiting transport ships. Many were weeping, unable to believe their salvation had finally come. Others moved with purpose, having been prepared for this moment by the underground network. "Captain," her XO called out, "we're detecting quantum fluctuations. Consortium reinforcements incoming." Maya smiled. "Right on schedule. Signal the Achilles fleet." Space twisted as humanity's newest weapons platforms emerged from quantum space. The Achilles-class interdiction vessels represented the peak of human military technology, ships designed specifically to counter consortium advantages. Their quantum fields prevented enemy vessels from escaping, while their weapons could pierce even the most advanced consortium shields. The arriving consortium fleet found itself trapped and outgunned. On their command channels, a message played in an endless loop. "Your slaves are free. Your council is in custody. Surrender and face justice, or resist and face oblivion. The choice, for once, is yours." In the council's observation deck, Kira faced the assembled leaders of the three most powerful slave empires in known space. They had expected to see hatred in the humans' eyes. Instead, they saw something far more terrifying: determination mixed with pity. "Why?" the Velkar High Commander demanded. "You could have conquered us, taken our resources, made us your slaves. Why go to all this effort just to free others?" Kira removed her combat frame's helmet, letting them see her face. "Because that's what makes us human. We remember our own history, centuries of slavery and oppression that we fought to overcome. We know the price of freedom, and we chose to pay it forward." The liberation of the Eternal Dominion marked a turning point. The consortium's carefully maintained image of invincibility shattered. Throughout their territory, slaves and sympathizers rose up, knowing they had humanity's support. Maya watched as the last transport ships loaded their precious cargo. The Eternal Dominion would be transformed into something its builders never imagined: a processing center not for enslaving species, but for helping them recover and rebuild. "Message from Earth Command," her XO reported. "Operation Avalanche is confirmed successful across all targets. 87 processing facilities liberated simultaneously. Estimated 3 billion slaves freed in the initial wave." Maya looked at the data scrolling across her display. The consortium's power structure was crumbling. Their own people were turning against them, inspired by humanity's example. The secret war was ending, and a new phase would begin. "Send word to Admiral Chen," she ordered. "Phase 3 is ready to commence. It's time to let the galaxy know that the age of slavery is over." The shadow step disappeared into quantum space, leaving behind a facility transformed from a symbol of oppression into a beacon of hope. The chains were breaking, and no force in the galaxy could reforge them. The encrypted quantum transmission reached Admiral James Chen as he stood in humanity's newest diplomatic facility, a massive space station called Haven that floated in neutral space. Around him, representatives from dozens of formerly enslaved species discussed their futures, while consortium defectors provided intelligence that would have been unthinkable months ago. "Sir," his AI assistant materialized beside him. "Colonel Sarah Chen reports Operation Mirror is complete." The Velkar High Command received the fabricated evidence. The Admiral allowed himself a small smile. The greatest weapon in humanity's arsenal wasn't their advanced technology or military might. It was the consortium's own paranoia and greed. For months, human intelligence operatives had been planting evidence suggesting that the three consortium powers were plotting against each other. The Mercath were led to believe the Ixtheri were hoarding secret wealth. The Ixtheri discovered proof that the Velkar were planning to seize control of all slave operations, and the Velkar found convincing evidence that the other two species had been secretly sterilizing their populations to reduce their numbers. None of it was true. But after centuries of maintaining power through deception and fear, the consortium powers were all too ready to believe the worst about each other. Status of the consortium fleets? Chen asked, watching as another group of freed slaves arrived at Haven. The Velkar have mobilized their home defense fleet, the AI reported. The Merkath are redirecting forces from their outer territories. The Ixtheri have begun evacuating their leadership to secure facilities. Each believes they are making preparations in secret. All are being tracked by our quantum network. A holographic display showed the movements of massive fleet formations. The three consortium powers were positioning themselves for what each thought would be a preemptive strike against betrayal. None realized they were dancing to humanity's tune. In a secure conference room aboard Haven, Colonel Chen briefed the latest group of defectors. "Your people built an empire on lies," she told them. "We're simply showing them the natural conclusion of that path. When no one can trust anyone, even the strongest alliance shatters." The defectors, mostly younger members of the consortium species who had grown disgusted with the slave trade, nodded in understanding. Many had been instrumental in planting the false evidence, using their knowledge of their own society's fears and prejudices. "The Merkath will strike first," one of them predicted. "They've always been the most aggressive. When they do, the others will see it as confirmation of their worst fears." Across consortium space, the carefully maintained facade of cooperation was crumbling. Trade routes were disrupted as each species began hoarding resources. Slave operations ground to a halt as no one could trust their shipments would reach their intended destinations. In the Haven Control Center, Admiral Chen watched as the first shots were fired. A Merkath patrol fleet, convinced they had detected an Ixtheri sabotage team, opened fire on a supply convoy. The Ixtheri responded with overwhelming force, believing this confirmed their intelligence about a planned Merkath invasion. The Velkar, seeing their partners turning on each other, launched their own attacks to seize critical infrastructure before it could be destroyed in the growing conflict. Within hours, the entire consortium was engulfed in civil war. "Launch humanitarian operations," Chen ordered. "I want rescue ships ready to evacuate slaves and civilians from every combat zone. Priority to medical facilities and population centers." As the consortium tore itself apart, humanity emerged not as a conqueror, but as a savior. Human ships braved war zones to rescue those caught in the crossfire. Haven's medical facilities were overwhelmed with refugees who couldn't believe their former masters were offering them sanctuary. "They're doing exactly what we predicted," Colonel Chen reported during a staff meeting. "Each attack convinces them the false intelligence was real. Each betrayal validates their fears. They're so convinced they're being clever, they can't see the larger pattern." The Admiral nodded grimly. "And the sleeper programs? In place. The moment any of them try to use their Detman protocols against the slave populations, our virus packages will activate. Their control systems will shut down completely." This was humanity's ultimate insurance policy. While the consortium powers fought each other, human cyber warfare teams had infiltrated their slave control infrastructure. Any attempt to harm their former slaves out of spite would backfire spectacularly. As the Civil War escalated, more and more consortium citizens flooded to human space. They found something unprecedented. A society where all species were treated equally, where former slaves worked alongside their liberators, where strength was measured not by how many you could control, but by how many you could help. "Message from Earth Command," the AI announced. "Phase 4 is authorized. Operation Dawn's Light may commence." Admiral Chen looked out at the streams of refugee ships arriving at Haven. The consortium had thought humans were naive idealists, too weak to understand the harsh realities of the galaxy. Instead, humanity had turned the consortium's own nature against itself, bringing down an empire of slavery without firing a single shot in open warfare. "Send word to all task forces," he ordered. "Prepare for the final phase. It's time to offer the consortium powers a choice: peace and cooperation, or mutual destruction." The Great Deception was nearly complete. The only question remaining was whether the consortium species could learn from their failures, or if they would cling to their pride until nothing remained of their civilization but cautionary tales. The combined leadership of humanity and their allies gathered in Haven's Grand Assembly Chamber. The massive viewscreen showed real-time footage of the consortium's civil war entering its final devastating phase. Admiral Chen stood at the podium, his expression solemn as he addressed the gathered representatives. "For 3 months, the consortium powers have exhausted themselves in pointless conflict," he began. "Their military forces are depleted. Their economies are in ruins. And most importantly, their control over the enslaved populations has completely collapsed." Colonel Sarah Chen stepped forward, her tactical display highlighting key strategic points across former consortium space. 97% of all slave control systems have been neutralized. The remaining 3% are isolated and contained. The underground railroad we established has successfully evacuated over 12 billion former slaves to safe zones. The assembled representatives, humans, freed slaves, and consortium defectors alike, watched as new data streamed across the displays. The once mighty slave empire had torn itself apart exactly as humanity had planned. But now came the most crucial phase of all. "Operation Dawn's Light commences in 6 hours, Admiral Chen announced. "For the first time, we will reveal ourselves not as shadows and rumors, but as the architects of the consortium's collapse. And we will offer them a choice." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Humanity would simultaneously broadcast the truth to all consortium territories. Evidence of how they had been manipulated, proof that their paranoid fears of each other had been weaponized against them. But more importantly, they would offer a path forward. Crix, their crystalline form now adorned with the insignia of Haven's diplomatic corps, interfaced with the central computer. "The peace proposals are ready. Each consortium power will be offered the same terms: immediate and permanent abolition of slavery, integration into the new galactic cooperative, and a chance to rebuild their societies under supervision." The alternative, though unspoken, was clear. The consortium powers were already on the brink of collapse. Without external aid, their civilizations would crumble completely. As the appointed hour approached, humanity's fleets took up position throughout former consortium space. Not as conquerors, but as peacekeepers, they would prevent any last-minute atrocities while ensuring humanitarian aid reached those in need. Admiral Chen stood on Haven's primary observation deck, watching as the massive quantum communication array powered up. Beside him, his sister Sarah and his niece Kira represented the 3 generations of their family that had helped bring this moment to fruition. "Transmission commencing," the AI announced. Across thousands of worlds, the truth was finally revealed. The consortium citizens learned how their leaders' own tactics had been turned against them, how humanity had orchestrated their downfall, not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of their psychological weaknesses. The response was beyond even their most optimistic projections. Within hours, the Velkar High Command sued for peace. Their population, long uncomfortable with the slave trade, but too afraid to oppose it, welcomed the chance for redemption. The Ixtheri, ever practical, quickly calculated that cooperation offered better prospects than resistance. The Merkath proved more stubborn, but their own people made the decision for them. Civilian uprisings, coordinated through the very underground networks established to free slaves, toppled their hardline leadership within days. "Message from Earth Command," the AI reported. "The Galactic Cooperative Charter has been ratified by the interim governments of all 3 former consortium powers." Admiral Chen watched as celebration erupted throughout Haven. Former slaves embraced their liberators. Consortium defectors wept as they were welcomed as equals by those they had once helped enslave. It was messy, emotional, and gloriously human. Was it worth it? Kira asked her father and aunt. All the deception, the manipulation. Sarah Chen smiled. We beat them at their own game, but we did it to free people, not enslave them. I'd say that makes all the difference. The admiral nodded, watching as more ships arrived at Haven. Not refugee vessels this time, but diplomatic missions from the former consortium powers. We showed them a better way, not through force, but through example. That's always been humanity's greatest strength, not our ability to fight wars, but our ability to imagine and create peace. The former slave empire was transforming into something unprecedented. A cooperative of equals, united not by force or fear, but by shared values and mutual respect. The chains were broken, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually as well. As the celebration continued around them, Admiral Chen received one final report. The last slave control facility had been deactivated. The age of the consortium was officially over. In its place, a new era was dawning, one where humanity's greatest victory had come not from dominating others, but from setting them free. Send word to Earth, he ordered. Operation Dawn's Light is complete. The liberation of the galaxy is accomplished. And across the stars, billions of newly freed beings looked up at their skies and, for the first time in their lives, saw not the darkness of oppression, but the light of hope.